Hello Year 4. The story that I'm going to share with you today, or I'm going to start sharing with you, is Tutankhamun's Arrow, and the author is Karen Wallace. Okay. Right, chapter 1. 2 minutes before the end of the last period on Friday afternoon, Mr. Murdoch, the history teacher, picked up a thick black pen and unrolled a scroll of paper. On it he drew something like a beetle, balancing a ball on top of 3 matchsticks and a pudding bowl. It looked like this. Underneath he wrote the word Tutankhamun in big letters. 1 minute before the end of the last period on Friday afternoon, Mr. Murdoch turned to the 40 faces watching him. "Who knows anything about Tutankhamun?" he asked. Class 5A thought as one. With barely 30 seconds left, any serious reply was definitely out of the question. 10 seconds ticked by. "He was a bit of a mummy's boy," shouted Darren Jackson from the back. The class erupted in laughter. Mr. Murdoch grinned. "Not exactly, Darren," he said. "Tutankhamun was an ancient Egyptian king who was preserved as a mummy and buried in a tomb beneath the pyramid." He pointed to his strange drawing. "These symbols mean Tutankhamun." Mr. Murdoch pinned the scroll of paper to the wall. "Tutankhamun is going to be our new project on Monday morning," he said. "I hope everyone has a good weekend." There was a ragged chorus of "Thank you, Mr. Murdoch," and "You too, Mr. Murdoch," as chairs scraped across the floor. Lucy Turnbull slung her backpack over her shoulder, put her head down and made for the door. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see her friends Ellie and Kate watching her curiously. On most days, the 3 of them stayed behind for a quick gossip. "You going?" called Ellie. Lucy nodded. "I have to meet my mum." Mum worked nights at the local hospital, so she wasn't able to come to the school very often. Lucy and her brother Joe usually walked home with a group of friends who lived in the same street. But today was different. Mum was meeting them. She was taking the children to a sneak preview of a jumble sale that was being held the next day in the local community centre. Lucy and her mum loved poking through old stuff, and Lucy had a knack of finding special things. Once at a car boot sale, she had found a sequined waistcoat tucked inside an old sweater. Kate and Ellie had gone half berserk with jealousy, and they hadn't known that it had only cost her 25p. Joe hated jumble sales. He associated them with hanging around outside church halls while he waited for his mother and his sister. They always took ages. As far as Joe was concerned, jumble sales were a complete waste of time. So that morning after breakfast, Lucy and Mum struck a deal with Joe. For the most part, it wasn't difficult to find a solution that kept everyone happy. Joe and Lucy got on reasonably well. Lucy was almost 11 and older than her brother, but there was only 18 months between them. They were both tall, with the same unruly blonde hair and grey-green eyes. In fact, many people thought that they were twins when they were younger. They used to pretend they were. "How about this?" said Mrs. Turnbull as she made their lunch sandwiches. "I'll pick you up from school and then we'll have a quick look at the jumble before I go to work. It'll only take 20 minutes. 20 minutes? Wailed Joe. His heart sank. 20 hours more like. "And I'll play football with you when we get home," said Lucy in a reasonable voice. "We can walk home from the community centre, can't we, Mum?" Mrs. Turnbull nodded. It was only a short walk and there were no busy streets. "Who's going to make my tea?" asked Joe. Mrs. Turnbull laughed. "Don't sound so grumpy, Joe. I'll leave your tea in the fridge. And Granny said she'd drop by to keep you company until Dad gets home." Lucy grinned at her mother. "We won't need company, Mum. We'll be playing football." Mrs. Turnbull grinned back. "Then Granny can be the referee." "Or watch the telly," said Joe. "Or watch the telly," repeated Mum, rumpling his hair. And that had been that. The deal was agreed, and after school Joe was standing at the main gate. Lucy waved when she saw him. She felt for the warm 50p coin in her jacket pocket and thought gleefully of all the bargains that she might find. 20 minutes, said Joe. OK. I know, said Lucy. That's what we agreed. Just checking, muttered Joe. At that moment, Mrs. Turnbull appeared. Anyone for a bar of chocolate? Yes, please, they replied in unison. Mrs. Turnbull handed out chocolate bars and they set off down the street. So, what happened at school today? We got our new project, said Joe through a mouthful of chocolate. So did we, replied Lucy. What did you get? Henry VIII. What about you? Tutankhamun. Who? Mrs. Turnbull pulled her face. You remember, Joe, the ancient Egyptian king that we saw at the British Museum. Joe shrugged. Guess I'll find out next year. Lucy exchanged looks with her mother and laughed. Guess you will. They turned right off the high street and crossed over a zebra crossing. It's over here, said Lucy, pointing across the street. I'll hang around outside, said Joe. Lucy looked disappointed. Oh, come in, she said. I'll feel guilty if you're waiting for me. Mrs. Turnbull took Joe's arm and pulled him across the street. Come on, she said kindly. You might find a T-shirt that Gaz's mum threw out by mistake. Joe allowed himself to be pushed into the community centre. 20 minutes, he said to Lucy under his breath. A group of women were inside emptying plastic sacks of clothes onto a table. A few others were already poking through the piles. Darren Jackson's mum waved when she saw Mrs. Turnbull. Almost everything's out, she called. Have a good look. You too, Joe, she added, quickly because Joe seemed so awkward standing by the door. Lucy immediately started digging through the pile of clothes nearest her. Joe went off into a dark corner and prodded a row of cardboard boxes. Mrs. Turnbull took one look with a well-practised eye and decided to have a chat with Mrs. Jackson instead. 5 minutes later, Lucy was half hidden in a rail of old coats. Probably going through the pockets, thought Mrs. Turnbull, as she walked over to a beige Macintosh sprouting purple leggings. I'm off, Lucy, she said. 15 minutes, then straight home. OK, Mum, bye. Bye, said Mrs. Turnbull, and she looked across the room. Joe was still in his dark corner. Bye, Joe. Bye, Mum. 15 minutes later, Lucy had found nothing, and she felt cross and disappointed. As she straightened up from the last plastic sack, which hadn't been emptied, Joe tapped her on the shoulder. I know, said Lucy, trying not to sound how she felt. Joe looked embarrassed. Lucy, he said, have you got any money? Lucy stared at his red face. I don't believe it, she said. I thought you hated jumble sales. What have you found? It's a bow and arrow, said Joe. He patted his pockets. Thing is, it's 50p and... It's yours, grinned Lucy. She fished into her pocket and handed him the warm silver coin. So what's so special about this bow and arrow? Asked Lucy as they walked home. Joe shrugged. It looks weird and I wanted it. Maybe you could put it on your wall, suggested Lucy. Or maybe I could shoot with it, said Joe. We can make one of those big targets. I've never shot an arrow, said Lucy. While she was speaking, she had the sudden feeling of something being close behind her. She turned and saw a black cat walking down the middle of the pavement. Lucy stopped. The cat stopped too. That's funny, muttered Lucy. What's funny? Asked Joe. The cat, it seems to be following us. Lucy looked puzzled. Maybe it lives around here. It better not come home with us, muttered Joe, sniffing. Joe was allergic to animal hairs, which was why the family didn't have any cats. Now that Lucy was older, she didn't mind that much, but there had been a time when she'd really wanted a kitten, especially a black kitten, more than anything in the world. The cat stared back at her, narrowing its big yellow eyes. Lucy had the strangest feeling that it was reading her mind. When they turned into their street, she looked around. The cat was still behind them.